Welcome back to another episode of Philippine True Crime Radio, where we uncover the most chilling and controversial cases in the country. Tonight, we take you deep into a case so brutal, so meticulously planned, that it should have been the perfect crime. A young mother, fighting for custody of her children, disappears without a trace. For 2 years, her family searches for answers, until a man walks into a police station and reveals a horrifying secret. A steel box is pulled from the sea, sealed with cement and silence. Inside, they find the truth. Ruby Rose Barrameda didn't just vanish. She was erased. Her killers were named. Her body was found. The case should have been solved. But in a country where power and influence dictate justice, nothing is ever that simple. How did a murder with so much evidence still end in freedom for the accused? What happened to the key witness who exposed it all, only to disappear himself? And most importantly, who will fight for those who have no power when the system protects only the privileged? This is the story of Ruby Rose Barrameda, the woman who was buried twice. Stay with us. The waters off Navotas City had always carried their share of secrets. The murky depths, choked with industrial waste and the remnants of the city's fast-paced life, were the perfect place to make something, or someone, disappear. But on June 10, 2009, something rose from the abyss. A steel box, rusted at the edges. Its once smooth metal exterior was now battered and corroded by the salt water. It took a team of workers and authorities several minutes to haul it up from the sea, its weight far greater than expected. The onlookers, harbor workers, local fishermen, and even a few reporters who had gotten wind of the operation, watched in tense silence. Something was inside. Something heavy. Something not meant to be found. As the officers pried open the box, a gut-wrenching stench of decay erupted into the air, forcing some to recoil, gagging. Inside, encased in solid cement, was the contorted body of a woman. Her arms and legs were bound, her mouth gagged and covered in tape. Bruises marked what remained of her fragile frame, and her neck bore the telltale signs of strangulation. She had been buried alive in stone, sealed in a tomb of concrete and steel, and cast into the sea, never meant to be found. But fate had other plans. The only reason the steel coffin was retrieved that day was because of one man's conscience breaking under the weight of his sins. His name was Manuel Montero. A former associate of a powerful family, he walked into a police station unannounced, hands trembling, eyes darting around the room as if expecting someone to silence him before he could speak. His voice cracked as he uttered the words that would shake the nation. "I was part of the group that killed Ruby Rose Barrameda. I know where her body is." For 2 years, Ruby's family had searched, prayed, and pleaded for any sign of her. For 2 years, her name had been whispered in police stations, her face flashed across missing person reports, her memory preserved in the desperate hope that she would come home. But now that hope was dead. Montero led authorities to the exact location in the Navotas waters where the steel box had been dumped, an area the Jimenez family had ties to. His chillingly accurate account left little room for doubt. He knew too much, down to the smallest, most disturbing details. She was strangled. Tied up. We put her in a drum. Filled it with cement. Then we welded the box shut. Took it out to sea and let the ocean swallow it. Every word he spoke added another weight to the air, pressing down on investigators like a suffocating fog. And when the steel box was finally lifted from its watery grave, Montero's confession transformed into cold, irrefutable truth. It didn't take long for forensic teams to confirm the victim's identity. The DNA tests were conclusive. The woman in the cement tomb was Ruby Rose Barrameda. The news spread like wildfire, sending shockwaves across the country. A young mother, missing for 2 years, wasn't just another unsolved case. She had been silenced in the most gruesome way imaginable. But the biggest question still remained: who wanted Ruby dead? Montero had pointed the finger at the Jimenez family, her wealthy, powerful in-laws. And if his accusations were true, this wasn't just a brutal killing. It was an execution ordered by the very people who had once called Ruby family. But why? What had Ruby done that warranted such a monstrous fate? Was it truly just about custody of her children? Or was there something darker, something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface, secrets buried along with her body? With Ruby's body recovered and the horrifying details coming to light, it was no longer just a case of a missing woman. It was a murder with powerful suspects, a crime so carefully planned and executed that it had almost been perfect. Almost. And now the truth, the cemented truth, was beginning to crack. To the world, Ruby Rose Barrameda was just another young mother trying to reclaim her life. She was 27 years old, a woman caught in the middle of a bitter legal battle over the two people she loved most, her daughters. She had been a devoted mother, fighting through a messy separation with her husband, Manuel III Jimenez III, and facing an uphill battle against his powerful, well-connected family. The Jimenezes weren't just wealthy, they were influential. They owned businesses, ran in elite circles, and had the kind of money that made problems disappear. But Ruby refused to disappear. She fought back. She refused to let them take her daughters. And then, one afternoon in March 2007, Ruby left her home to visit her children at the Jimenez family compound. She never returned. A seemingly ordinary Wednesday. But for Ruby, it was a day of high anxiety and unease. That morning, she received a court order that delivered a crushing blow. Her attempt to get a temporary protection order had been denied. This meant that, despite her allegations of domestic abuse, the courts had granted full custody of her two daughters to her husband, III Jimenez. It wasn't just devastating. It was dangerous. Ruby was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if she didn't comply. Afraid that if she fought harder, things might get worse. But what choice did she have? Her daughters were just 7 years old and 3 months old, far too young to be separated from their mother. By the afternoon, Ruby made a decision. She had to see her children. At 2 p.m., she left her home in Moonwalk Village, Las Piñas City, and headed toward BF Homes in Parañaque, where the Jimenez family resided. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. By 4 p.m., Ruby's phone had gone silent. Her older sister, Rochelle Barrameda, received a call from one of Ruby's friends, worried because Ruby wasn't answering her phone. At first, Rochelle brushed it off. Maybe her sister was still with the kids, maybe she was caught up in the visit. But then hours passed, and still nothing. Rochelle began making calls. She dialed Ruby's phone again and again. No response. She called the Jimenez residence, but the answers she got only deepened her fears. Ruby wasn't there, they claimed. She had never been there, and they had no idea where she was. But that didn't make sense. Ruby had gone there for one reason, to see her daughters. Where else would she have gone? Rochelle's gut told her something was terribly wrong. By nightfall, the Barrameda family was in full panic mode. Rochelle and her family started calling everyone they knew, friends, relatives, colleagues, hoping someone had seen Ruby. No one had. Her father, Robert Barrameda, went straight to the police. He filed a missing persons report and begged authorities to act fast. But in the Philippines, missing adults aren't always a priority. Police officers shrugged off the urgency, saying maybe Ruby had just run off. Maybe she needed time alone. But the Barramedas knew better. Ruby would never abandon her children. She had fought too hard to keep them close. She was in the middle of a legal battle. She had a scheduled court hearing in just 2 days. There was no reason for her to disappear voluntarily. The days that followed were a blur of frustration and fear. The Barrameda family searched relentlessly. They went to hospitals, police stations, morgues, everywhere that a missing person might turn up. They pleaded with news stations, hoping Ruby's face on TV would jog someone's memory. They questioned the Jimenez family again and again, but their responses were always the same. We don't know where she is. She never came to see the kids. Maybe she left the country. The silence from law, especially when he took the one thing she couldn't live without, her daughters. In the Philippines, the law is clear. No child under the age of 7 shall be separated from their mother unless the court finds compelling reasons to order otherwise. Ruby had 2 daughters, one was 7, the other just 3 months old. By all accounts, the law should have been in her favor. But in 2007, despite Ruby's pleas, legal filings, and domestic violence complaints, the court awarded full custody to Third Jimenez. It was a decision that left her devastated and terrified. "I know what he's capable of. If they stay with him, I may never see them again." The ruling wasn't just unfair. It was suspicious. The Jimenez family wasn't just rich, they were influential, with deep connections in the legal system. Was this a case of courtroom corruption, or had Ruby somehow lost against a man who knew how to manipulate the law to his advantage? Either way, she wasn't going to give up. Determined to reclaim her children, Ruby filed a motion for reconsideration. She pleaded with the courts to review the case, arguing that she was their rightful guardian and that her daughters belonged with their mother. But at every turn, she was blocked, denied, delayed. The domestic abuse allegations she filed against Third? Dismissed. Her petition for a protection order? Quashed. The custody battle? A never-ending cycle of hearings and legal red tape. The Jimenezes were making it clear this wasn't just about the children anymore. This was about power, control, retribution. And Ruby was running out of time. By March 2007, the custody battle had reached a critical turning point. Ruby was set to testify in court in just 2 days, a testimony that could have changed everything. She was prepared to speak out against Third and his family. She was going to fight for her daughters with everything she had. But someone made sure she never got the chance. She vanished just 48 hours before she was due in court. Coincidence? Or premeditated silencing? Her testimony never happened. Her voice was never heard. And her body wouldn't be found for 2 years. Who had the most to gain from her disappearance? The answer was painfully obvious. But proving it? That was an entirely different battle. For most missing person cases, the first 48 hours are the most critical. The longer someone remains missing, the slimmer the chances of finding them dead or alive. But Ruby Rose Barrameda wasn't just missing. She was erased. Days turned into weeks. Weeks stretched into months. And as the 2-year mark approached, it became painfully clear whoever had taken Ruby had done so with terrifying precision. No body. No crime scene. No answers. Her family's desperate pleas for help were met with silence, indifference, and resistance. Authorities dragged their feet, treating the case as if Ruby had simply run away, as if she had chosen to abandon her daughters, as if there wasn't something far more sinister at play. For the Jimenez family, life went on as usual. For the Barramedas, life had stopped. To outsiders, the Jimenez name commanded respect and admiration. A family of business tycoons, they had money, connections, and influence in the highest places. To Ruby's family, the Jimenez name meant something far more chilling. Fear, power, untouchability. Her father-in-law, Manuel Jimenez Jr., was a lawyer and businessman with deep political ties. He owned gas stations, agricultural lands, and fishing businesses, one of which operated near the exact waters where Ruby's body would later be found. His brother, Lope Jimenez, was a fishing magnate controlling vast commercial fleets. Her husband, Third Jimenez, seemed almost indifferent to Ruby's disappearance despite being the last known person connected to her whereabouts. The Jimenez family had the means, the money, and the influence to make problems disappear. And Ruby was a problem. Her refusal to back down in the custody battle, her willingness to expose Third's abuse, her determination to break free, it all made her a liability. So, when she vanished without a trace, it wasn't just a coincidence. It was a message. From the moment Ruby went missing, her family knew something wasn't right. Ruby would never leave her daughters. They rejected the idea that she had fled on her own, that she had simply walked away from everything she had been fighting for. Someone took her. Someone wanted her gone. And in their eyes, there was only one family with a clear motive. But suspicions alone weren't enough. They needed proof. They needed a body. They needed the police to do their job. The Barrameda family filed reports, demanded answers, pleaded for help, but law enforcement barely lifted a finger. Each visit to the police station felt like a brick wall of excuses. There's no evidence of foul play. Maybe she left voluntarily. These cases take time. Time. How much time did they need? 1 month? 6 months? A year? 2 years passed and still nothing. The Jimenezes, with their deep pockets and powerful connections, seemed untouchable. If Ruby had been murdered, whoever did it had planned it perfectly. No body, no evidence, no case. A perfect crime. Or so they thought. Because in 2009, a man would walk into a police station, his conscience too heavy to bear, and destroy the illusion of their perfect crime forever. For 2 years, Ruby Rose Barrameda was nothing more than a name on a missing persons report. The case had grown cold, fading into the background like so many other unsolved disappearances. People whispered theories, speculated in hushed voices about what might have happened to the young mother, but in the absence of evidence, it seemed like the world had moved on. Her family, however, had never stopped searching. They had pleaded with the authorities, pushed for investigations, begged for answers. But every effort seemed to collide against an invisible wall. Until June 10, 2009. That day, a man walked into a police station, looking over his shoulder like someone might be following him. His hands trembled. His breath came in short, uneven gasps. He sat down across from the officers and, in a voice barely above a whisper, said something that made the entire room go still. "I was part of it." The officers glanced at one another, unsure of what they were about to hear. "I know where she is. Ruby Rose Barrameda. I can tell you where to find her body." His name was Manuel Montero, and his confession would change everything. Montero didn't hesitate. The story spilled from his lips in disturbing, methodical detail, as if the memories had been etched into his brain, haunting him night after night. Ruby, he explained, had been lured into the Jimenez family's home under the pretense of seeing her daughters. She had no reason to suspect danger. She had fought too hard to regain custody of her children. Why would she have imagined that walking into that house would seal her fate forever? She was barely inside when the ambush happened. Strong hands grabbed her, forcing her to the ground. A strip of tape was slapped across her mouth, muffling the screams that no one outside the compound would hear. Her wrists and ankles were bound, the rough material slicing into her skin as she thrashed against them. She was gagged, beaten, strangled, and left gasping for air, her body trembling from pain and exhaustion. Then came the final, irreversible step. A metal drum, its edges jagged and stained with rust, was brought into the room. It was empty for now. "We forced her into the drum," Montero said, his voice hollow. "She was still. She wasn't moving anymore." That's when the cement was poured thick, heavy, and suffocating. It slid over her like quicksand, filling every space, sealing her within a tomb of solid stone. Even in death, they wanted to ensure she could never be found. The men worked with an eerie precision. They had done this kind of job before. They knew exactly how to make someone disappear. Once the cement had hardened, the drum was welded shut, its contents forever sealed inside. Then, for an added layer of security, the entire drum was placed inside a larger steel box, locking Ruby's fate within layers of metal and stone. She was gone, but their work wasn't finished yet. Montero took a deep breath before continuing, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "The next night, we transported the box. A truck carried the heavy cargo to Navotas City, where a tugboat was waiting. We took it out to sea," he whispered, "far enough that no one would ever find it." The night was silent, the water calm, as the steel box was hoisted over the side of the boat. The men barely exchanged words, working in tense efficiency, moving as if they had done this exact thing before. Then, in one final, deliberate motion, they pushed. The splash was deafening in the quiet of the night. The weight of the steel dragged the box down fast, disappearing into the dark abyss. "And just like that," Montero said, his voice shaking, "she was gone. Problem solved. A loose end tied up. Or so they thought." Montero didn't just confess, he named names. And those names were not surprising. Manuel Jimenez Jr., Ruby's father-in-law, the one who allegedly gave the order. Lope Jimenez, Ruby's uncle-in-law, the man who oversaw the crime. Eric Fernandez, Lope's driver, involved in the abduction. Leonard Spike Descalso, third Jimenez's bodyguard, one of the men who strangled Ruby. Robert Ponce, a Jimenez family employee, who helped with disposal. But the most damning revelation was what Montero claimed about third Jimenez, Ruby's own husband. He may not have been physically there, Montero said, but he knew everything. And when the job was done, a call was made. "Sir, it's done. Your problem is solved." Montero paused, locking eyes with the officers across from him. The man on the other end of the call was third Jimenez, and he promised a bonus. For 2 years, the ocean had kept its secret. But now, authorities had a lead and a location. Police immediately mobilized a recovery mission, sending divers into the murky depths, where Montero claimed the steel box had been dumped. Took hours to find it. When it was hauled up, its once gleaming metal was rusted and corroded, evidence of its time beneath the waves. Still, it was intact. And when officers forced it open, the stench of decay hit them first, thick and suffocating. Inside, they saw the cement tomb. Slowly, they chipped away at the hardened stone, revealing the contorted remains of a woman. Her arms were still bound. Her face was still covered in tape. Her body, preserved in the cement, was still locked in the agony of her final moments. Forensic tests confirmed what Montero had already told them. The woman inside was Ruby Rose Barrameda. They had found her, but that was only the beginning. Because if the Jimenez family could get away with murder once, who was to say they wouldn't do it again? And what happened next would prove just how far they were willing to go to protect themselves. When the steel box was finally hoisted onto the dock, officers stood back, covering their noses. Even after 2 years underwater, the stench of death clung to the metal, a foul, suffocating odor that warned of the horror inside. Slowly, investigators pried open the box. Inside, encased in hardened cement, was the body of a woman. The cement had preserved her form, locking her in a twisted, unnatural position, her final moments forever frozen in stone. Officers took their time chipping away at the cement, revealing what had been hidden beneath the surface for far too long. And when they saw what had been done to her, some turned away in horror. Ruby's body was a testament to sheer cruelty. Her arms were bound behind her back, deep red marks still visible against her decayed skin. Her mouth was covered in layers of duct tape, ensuring that even if she had tried to scream, no one would have ever heard her. Her face, bruised and swollen, was barely recognizable, her once expressive eyes sealed shut forever. Her neck bore dark, strangulation marks, evidence of the brutal force used to squeeze the life out of her. Every inch of her body told a story of suffering. A life stolen. A mother silenced. A crime designed to be forgotten. But now the truth was out. Montero had laid out the plan in disturbing detail of how they had abducted Ruby, how she had struggled and fought, how they had restrained her, beaten her, and strangled her before dumping her lifeless body into a drum. The cement wasn't just a method of disposal. It was a death sentence with an insurance policy meant to erase all traces of evidence, to lock her body away in a prison of stone, ensuring that even if someone found her, there would be nothing left to examine. But even the best-laid plans can go wrong. And Ruby refused to stay buried. The ocean, which they had trusted to swallow the crime, had instead preserved it, and the confession of a guilty man had pulled it back to the surface. In the end, how much was Ruby's life worth to them? 50,000 pesos. That was the price put on her head. A sum so insultingly small that it made the crime even more revolting. 50,000 pesos. Less than a second-hand car. Less than a luxury handbag. Less than the cost of one of the Jimenez family's lavish parties. That's all it took to snuff out a life, to steal a mother from her children, to erase a woman who had fought too hard to be free. It was business to them, a transaction, a problem to be solved with money and silence. But no amount of money could undo the horror they had committed, because Ruby's body had been found, and now the world knew what they had done. On paper, this was a crime about a custody battle. The Jimenez family wanted to keep Ruby's daughters. They had fought her in court, blocked her legal efforts, and when that wasn't enough, they erased her. But was that really the reason she was killed? Or was there something deeper, darker, hidden beneath the surface? Some speculated that Ruby had learned something she wasn't supposed to know. Something about the Jimenez family's business dealings. Something that made her not just a nuisance, but a threat. Her father had his own suspicions. Maybe she found out about something illegal. Maybe she told them, "Give me back my daughters or I'll expose you." Maybe that's why they silenced her. But if that were true, what did she know? And would the truth ever come out? One thing was clear. Ruby was never supposed to be found. And now that she had been, the people responsible would stop at nothing to protect themselves. Because if the Jimenez family could make a mother disappear once, who's to say they wouldn't do it again? The recovery of Ruby Rose Barrameda's body should have been the turning point. A confession, a list of names. A body encased in cement. The evidence was there. Justice seemed inevitable. And for a brief moment, it felt like the Barrameda family had won. Shortly after the gruesome discovery, arrests were made. Manuel Jimenez Jr., Ruby's father-in-law, was taken into custody. Lope Jimenez, his brother, was placed on a wanted list. Several of the men Montero had named, including bodyguards and employees, were rounded up. It seemed like a reckoning had arrived, like the powerful Jimenez family was finally going to be held accountable for the monstrous crime they had orchestrated. But what happened next proved just how untouchable they really were. From the very beginning, Manuel III Jimenez III, Ruby's own husband, distanced himself from the crime. Despite Montero's damning testimony, despite the phone call linking him to the murder, despite the fact that Ruby disappeared right before a crucial custody hearing, Third refused to acknowledge any involvement. In fact, he went one step further. Instead of accepting that his estranged wife had been brutally murdered, he started pushing a different narrative, one that was as insulting as it was absurd. "That body is not Ruby's. My wife is still alive. She probably ran away. Maybe she left the country." Third even claimed that Ruby had cheated on him, that she was involved with another man, and that she might have staged her own disappearance. It was a desperate, flimsy excuse, but it didn't need to be convincing. Because the Jimenez family wasn't fighting this battle in the courtroom. They were fighting it with power, money, and influence. The case against Third Jimenez should have been open and shut. The confession was clear. The motive was obvious. The body had been found exactly where Montero said it would be. And yet, when the time came to formally charge him, the court refused. The judge ruled that Montero's testimony was not enough to indict Third Jimenez for parricide. There is no sufficient probable cause to link the husband to the crime. Just like that, the person who had gained the most from Ruby's death was free to walk away. And that wasn't the only thing falling apart. For a brief moment, it seemed like Manuel Jimenez Jr. and the others would still face trial. But one by one, the accused began slipping through the cracks. The Jimenez family's high-powered lawyers went to work, exploiting every loophole, technicality, and delay they could find. They filed motions to dismiss based on lack of evidence. They challenged Montero's credibility, painting him as an unreliable witness. They argued that too much time had passed, that the case had weak foundations. And one by one, the charges started disappearing. First, the murder case was dismissed against Manuel Jimenez Jr. Then, the arrest warrant for Lope Jimenez was lifted. And before the Barrameda family could even process what was happening, the court dismissed the case entirely. In the end, the wealthy, powerful Jimenez family walked free. When the verdict was announced, the Barramedas were devastated. Ruby had suffered an unimaginable fate. Her body had been left to rot in the ocean. Her killers had confessed to the crime. And yet, the justice system had let them all go. Rochelle Barrameda, Ruby's sister, spoke through tears of frustration and rage. For different government agencies found probable cause to charge them, but one judge decided to let them go. One judge erased everything. Even when the Department of Justice, the Court of Appeals, and the Supreme Court had backed the case, a single judge had undone it all. And the worst part? The key witness, the man whose confession had brought the case this far, was about to disappear too, because Manuel Montero was about to go missing. And when he did, it would seal Ruby's fate once and for all. For a while, Manuel Montero was the key to everything. His confession had shattered the illusion of a perfect crime. He had led authorities to Ruby Rose Barrameda's body, pinpointed exactly how she was murdered, and named the powerful men behind it all. His testimony should have sealed their fate. But in the months after his shocking revelations, something began to change. Montero wasn't the same man who had walked into the police station that day, ready to confess his sins. He was scared, and he had every reason to be. Montero was placed in protective custody, but he quickly realized that protection was just an illusion. Even behind bars, he didn't feel safe. He started expressing concerns to officers, his lawyers, and even to members of the Barrameda family. "They're going to kill me. I made a mistake. I should never have said anything." He became paranoid, refusing to eat food given to him, fearing it was poisoned. He stopped talking freely, always looking over his shoulder as if he was expecting someone to come for him at any moment. And then, just as the trial was gaining momentum, Montero made a shocking announcement. He was withdrawing everything. The man who had once described Ruby's murder in haunting detail, who had given investigators every piece of the puzzle, who had named names without hesitation, suddenly changed his story. In a handwritten statement, Montero claimed that his confession had been forced. "I was pressured into making false accusations against the Jimenez family. Everything I said was a lie." Just like that, he erased the truth he had fought to reveal. The body in the cement drum? A coincidence. The list of suspects? A mistake. The phone call between Third Jimenez and his men? It never happened. It was a complete reversal, and everyone knew why it was happening. The Jimenez family was powerful. They had already manipulated the legal system, delayed proceedings, and used their wealth to make problems disappear. And now they had done the one thing they needed to win this case. They made Montero change his story. But what they did next was even more sinister, because Montero wouldn't just take back his confession. He would disappear entirely. A month after withdrawing his testimony, Montero was transferred from witness protection to a police holding facility. The reason? He was no longer a credible witness. And just days later, in a moment that felt too convenient to be an accident, he simply walked out of custody. CCTV footage captured it all. Montero leaving the police facility, walking past officers who didn't even try to stop him, disappearing into the streets. No alarms, no chase, no explanation. Just like that, he was gone. He left voluntarily, authorities said. There was no foul play, they insisted, but no one believed them. Montero was the key witness in one of the most high-profile murder cases in the country, a case involving one of the wealthiest and most influential families. And yet, somehow he had managed to slip away unnoticed? It was too easy, too clean, too suspicious. For the Barrameda family, it was a crushing blow, because without Montero, the case was doomed. The moment Montero vanished, the court declared his confession inadmissible. The evidence they had built the case on, the body, the steel box, the cement drum, was suddenly worthless in the eyes of the law. The Jimenez family's lawyers wasted no time. They argued that without Montero's testimony, there was no longer proof linking their clients to the crime. And the court agreed. One by one, the charges were dropped. Lope Jimenez's arrest warrant was lifted. Manuel Jimenez Jr. was released. Third Jimenez remained untouched. The powerful men that Montero had named walked free. While Ruby Rose remained in her cement tomb, her killers never facing justice. The Barrameda family watched in horror and disbelief as years of fighting, searching, and hoping unraveled in an instant. All because one man vanished. Or rather, one man was made to disappear. Because no one ever saw Manuel Montero again. No body. No leads. No investigation. It was as if he had been swallowed by the same void that had once taken Ruby. And just like that, the perfect crime was perfect once more. For a brief moment, justice had seemed within reach. Ruby Rose Barrameda's body had been recovered from the ocean, locked inside a cement-filled drum, just as Manuel Montero had described. A full confession had exposed the names of the powerful men behind her murder. The truth had been pulled from the depths, dragged into the light for the world to see. And yet somehow it still wasn't enough. On August 15, 2015, a judge in Malabon Regional Trial Court announced the decision that would shatter the Barrameda family's faith in the justice system forever. All charges against the Jimenez family were dismissed. The powerful men who had orchestrated Ruby's murder, her father-in-law, her uncle-in-law, and the men who had abducted and killed her were free to walk away. The courtroom fell into a stunned, suffocating silence. Then, from the seats where Ruby's family sat, came the sound of muffled sobs, of disbelief, of grief giving way to fury. Because somehow the Jimenezes had won again. Ruby's father, Robert Barrameda, stared at the courtroom walls, unable to process what he had just heard. They murdered my daughter. They dumped her in the sea like garbage. And now they get to walk free? His voice cracked as he gripped the edges of the bench, his body trembling with rage. Ruby's sister, Rochelle Barrameda, had spent years fighting for justice. Years of pushing, pleading, waiting. She had been there when they pulled Ruby's body from the steel box. She had seen what had been done to her. And now, she watched as her sister's murderers walked away, untouched, unpunished. So this is how justice works in our country? So as long as you have money, you can kill someone and get away with it? The Jimenez family had erased Ruby in life, and now they had erased her in death, too. The dismissal made no sense. The Department of Justice had ruled there was enough evidence to prosecute. The Court of Appeals had upheld the charges. Even the Supreme Court had found probable cause to indict the accused. And yet, one judge had overturned it all. The Malabon Regional Trial Court judge ruled that without Montero's testimony, the case had no solid foundation. Never mind that Montero had led police to the exact location of Ruby's body. Never mind that his confession had matched forensic findings. Never mind that 4 government agencies had already deemed the case strong enough for trial. The judge's decision was final. And just like that, years of legal battles were undone in a single ruling. It was a slap in the face to Ruby's family, and a clear reminder of just how broken the justice system was. The news of the verdict spread quickly, igniting a firestorm of debate and outrage. Some were horrified by the injustice. If a case this high-profile can be thrown out, what hope is there for ordinary victims? The Jimenez family bought their freedom. This was never a fair fight. This isn't justice. This is corruption at its finest. Protests erupted, with women's rights advocates and activists calling for judicial reform. The case became a symbol of everything wrong with the Philippine justice system, a brutal reminder that power and money could rewrite the law. But not everyone was convinced of the Jimenez family's guilt. Some believed the entire case had been politically motivated, that Montero had been forced to confess under pressure. Maybe the Jimenezes were framed. Maybe this was just a setup by their enemies. The debate played out across social media, television debates, and newspaper editorials, but no amount of public discourse would change the final, crushing reality. The case was closed. And Ruby's killers were free. For the Barramedas, this was more than just a legal defeat. It was proof that justice in the Philippines was not for people like them, for people who were powerless against the elite. It didn't matter that they had found Ruby's body. It didn't matter that they had a confession. It didn't matter that everyone knew the truth. Because in a country where the rich could buy their way out of any crime, truth was never enough. As the Jimenez family celebrated their victory, Ruby's family mourned her all over again. They had buried her once in a coffin of cement. And now the justice system had buried her a second time under a verdict designed to silence her forever. But the Barramedas refused to let Ruby's story die. Because if justice wouldn't fight for her, then they would. The Barrameda family should have been able to grieve. They should have been able to find peace, knowing that the people who had stolen Ruby's life were behind bars. Instead, they were left with nothing. No justice. No closure. No accountability. The system had failed them. But they refused to let it bury Ruby's story. The case may have been officially closed, but for Ruby's family, the fight was far from over. They spoke out in every interview they could, keeping her name alive in the media. They pushed for legislative changes, hoping to fix the cracks in the justice system that had allowed her killers to walk free. They held on to one hope, that someday the truth would rise again. But there was one question that haunted them, one loose end that no one could explain. What happened to Manuel Montero? The man who had shattered the silence, who had led police to Ruby's body, who had named every person involved, who had described the crime in chilling detail, was now a ghost. He had recanted his statement. He had walked away from police custody. And then he was gone. No sightings. No reports. No investigation. It was as if he had never existed. The Barramedas had their suspicions. Had he been paid off to disappear? Had he been silenced permanently? Or had he simply run, knowing his fate if he stayed? The Philippine justice system never looked for him. To the courts, he no longer mattered. But to Ruby's family, he was the missing piece, the only one who could have kept the case alive. And now he was gone. In the years that followed, the most heartbreaking detail remained the same: Ruby's daughters never saw her buried. The Jimenez family had kept them away from the wake, from the funeral, from everything. Ruby had fought for them until the day she died, and yet they never even got the chance to say goodbye. At just 9 years old, Ruby's eldest daughter reportedly said, "I am happy with my life now. I want to focus on my studies." Words that felt too rehearsed, too polished, as if they had been fed to her by the very people who took her mother away. Ruby's family never got to tell them the truth. They never got to hold them, to comfort them, to remind them of how fiercely their mother had loved them. Instead, the girls were raised by the very people who had orchestrated their mother's murder. And that was perhaps the cruelest injustice of all. The final question: who will fight for the powerless? The Barramedas had done everything right. They had searched. They had fought the courts. They had never given up hope. And yet, the system had let them down at every turn. So they asked the question that everyone was too afraid to confront: if justice is for the powerful, who will fight for those who have none? Who speaks for the mothers who were silenced? Who fights for the families who were denied justice? Who protects the next Ruby Rose Barrameda before it's too late? This case remains one of the most frustrating and heartbreaking unsolved murders in the Philippines. The Jimenez family is free. The main witness is missing. And the justice system has closed the door on the case. But the Barrameda family has not given up. They continue to speak her name, to tell her story, to remind the world that Ruby Rose Barrameda mattered. Because a system that protects the powerful and silences the powerless is a system that must be challenged. And as long as her family still fights, Ruby's story will never fade. But the question remains: will the truth ever prevail?